September 1944. A farmstead near Chartres, France. Dust settles over an isolated stone barn as American soldiers move through the courtyard. The air inside the structure is cold and thick, with the scent of dried hay and old wood. On the dirt floor lie 4 bodies, huddled together, uncovered and left where they fell weeks ago. A father, a mother, a teenage girl, and a young boy. Upstairs in the dark hayloft, a leather flight jacket hangs from a rusty nail, a silent testament to the American pilot who once hid there. The neighbors stand outside in absolute silence, a silence that screams louder than any shell. General George S. Patton will soon stand in this exact barn, look at the dust on the jacket, and deliver a verdict that turns an abandoned graveyard into a place of absolute, mirrored justice. This is the story of what Patton found on a farm where a family was executed for hiding an American pilot. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the silence that screamed louder than any shell. Pierre Fournier was a 48-year-old French gendarme from the rural districts outside Chartres. He was a quiet man who wore a faded blue uniform and carried the heavy weight of the occupation on his shoulders every single day. For 20 years, he had protected the local farming communities, knowing every family, every field, and every barn by heart. When the German army swept through the region, Fournier stayed at his post to shield his people from the worst of the terror, acting as a buffer between the invaders and the innocent. He knew the Moreau family intimately, having watched their children grow from infancy into youth. The sudden dawn raid by the secret police left him completely powerless to intervene, a devastating failure that shattered his spirit. Now, he walked alongside the advancing Americans, driven by a fierce, burning necessity to show the world the exact price his friends had paid. Stefan Lang was a 37-year-old Gestapo criminal commissar who grew up in the wealthy districts of Vienna, Austria. He was a dedicated ideologue who viewed the local populace not as human beings, but as subjects to be broken and controlled through absolute fear. He wore a perfectly tailored black woolen coat that remained immaculate despite the dust of the French countryside, and his leather boots were always polished to a mirror shine. Lang believed completely in the total supremacy of his state, often declaring to his subordinates that mercy was a dangerous luxury that only the weak could afford. He operated with an unearned sense of aristocratic privilege, carrying himself like a nobleman clearing pests from an estate rather than a military investigator. To Lang, the laws of humanity did not apply to those who chose to stand in the way of his orders. He looked at the French farmers as mere statistics, obstacles to be removed with total, cold efficiency. By September of 1944, the German occupation of France was fracturing under the immense weight of the Allied advance. The rapid push of the Third Army had unhinged the German administrative network, sending frontline troops into headlong retreats and leaving behind isolated pockets of secret police. In the chaos of this withdrawal, the Gestapo grew increasingly desperate, hunting down anyone suspected of assisting the Allied forces with vicious intensity. They operated without oversight, carrying out summary executions in remote fields and villages far away from the retreating front lines. The vast farmlands surrounding Chartres became a landscape of extreme paranoia, where the simple act of survival required navigating a treacherous web of collaborators and hidden refugees. Many local families took the ultimate risk by sheltering downed Allied airmen, relying on the deep isolation of their properties to keep their secret safe from the occupation authorities. Many regular military officers on both sides often looked the other way when dealing with civilian sympathizers during the hectic final days of an occupation. They focused their limited energy on moving equipment, securing vital crossroads, and managing their own retreating columns before the American armor could cut them off entirely. They allowed small infractions to slide, preferring to leave the civilian population to the incoming authorities rather than wasting precious time and ammunition on policing local farms. But the political police operated under entirely different parameters, viewing every hidden pilot as a direct threat to their remaining authority. They chose to spend their final hours conducting brutal raids on undefended homesteads, enforcing the ultimate penalty to terrify the local populations into compliance, even as their own empire collapsed around them. The isolated stone barn near Chartres remained untouched by the grand maneuvers of the armored divisions, standing completely silent in the morning mist as the Americans finally breached the perimeter of the property. An American captain from the 3rd Army Intelligence Branch walked into the temporary headquarters in Chartres, his boots tracking dried mud across the stone floor. He held a bundle of official field reports and a map of the surrounding farming districts. Across the wooden table sat the German officer who had been detained near the edge of the town earlier that morning. The American took a deep breath, keeping his voice level as he opened the folder. He asked if the officer was familiar with the isolated farmstead located 3 miles to the north. The prisoner did not look up from his hands. He smoothed the sleeve of his dark woolen coat, clearing away a tiny speck of dust with his thumb. He stated that he had conducted many operations in that sector, and that a single farm meant absolutely nothing to him. He added that his duties required the strict enforcement of security, not the tracking of minor properties. The captain tapped the desk with his fountain pen, leaning closer to the prisoner. He stated that 4 civilians had been found dead inside that specific barn, including a teenage girl and a 12-year-old boy. He noted that the local gendarme had identified the unit responsible for the raid, pointing directly to the secret police detachment that had operated under the prisoner's direct supervision. The captain asked why an entire family had been destroyed when the American pilot they sheltered was simply sent to a regular prisoner of war camp. The German officer raised his head, his face completely expressionless as he looked at the American. He stated that the local population had been warned repeatedly about the consequences of assisting the enemy. He explained that a pilot was a piece of military property belonging to a foreign state, whereas the locals were subjects who had committed a deliberate act of treason against the occupation authorities. He added that the family had made a conscious choice to harbor an enemy flyer, and that they had simply shared the inevitable fate of an enemy combatant. He stated that his actions were entirely justified under the emergency decrees, and that he had a duty to make an example of those who chose to defy his orders. The captain looked at the man's polished boots, then down at the explicit details recorded in the French gendarme's testimony. He realized the individual sitting across from him felt no remorse, viewed the children as mere statistics, and considered his rank an absolute shield against any form of accountability. The captain closed the folder slowly, recognizing that this situation exceeded his authority. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the gate of the headquarters, the tires throwing grit against the stone walls. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory revolvers hung low on his belt, catching the sharp French sunlight. The room fell into absolute silence the moment his boots struck the floorboards. No one moved, no one saluted. The general did not raise his voice, but his presence filled the small room like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. He walked straight to the wooden table, his eyes locked on the German officer who sat waiting. Patton studied him. "Did you order the executions at the Moreau farm?" he asked. The prisoner leaned back slightly, his fingers touching his lapel. "I carried out necessary security measures against treasonous civilians under the existing laws of war," the German replied. "Did you shoot the parents first to make the 12-year-old boy watch?" Patton asked. The German shrugged his shoulders. "The demonstration of force was required to ensure the absolute compliance of the neighboring populace," he answered. "Did you leave their bodies on the dirt floor of that barn like slaughtered animals?" Patton asked. The prisoner looked away toward the window. "Dead rebels do not require military burials," he said. Patton stood completely still, his hands resting near his side arms. "You come from Vienna, a city that boasts of its music and its culture, yet you brought nothing but the stench of the butcher shop to this valley. You talk about the laws of war as if they are a license for slaughter, but you are not a soldier." You are an investigator who hides behind a desk and orders the murder of children because you lack the courage to face an armed enemy on an open field. This family did what we ask of every true ally. They saw a downed American pilot who was alone, hungry, and hunted, and they opened their door to him. They gave him food from their own table and a place to rest in their hayloft. They knew the risk, yet they chose to do what was right, while their neighbors chose the path of the coward. You stood in that barn and told them they would share the pilot's fate because they chose to hide him. You thought your uniform made you a god who could dictate who lives and who dies in these hills. But your empire is gone, your security decrees are garbage, and the authority you used to murder those children is completely broken. You have a choice. You can lead my men back to that farmstead right now. Pick up the shovels and prepare a place of honor for the people you destroyed. Or you can face the immediate consequence of a military tribunal that will look at your signature on that execution order. Decide now. The German officer looked at the floor, his face pale, his mouth clamped into a tight, thin line. The squad of American infantrymen led the prisoner into the courtyard of the farmstead, the heavy iron shovels clinking against each other in the morning air. The German officer stood by the stone wall, his polished leather boots sinking into the wet mud of the driveway, as the local French neighbors watched from the perimeter in total silence. A detail of military police officers stood guard with loaded carbines, their expressions completely neutral, as they watched the prisoner strip off his tailored woolen coat and drop it onto the damp earth. The German began to dig, his hands blistering within minutes on the rough wooden handles of the standard-issue American trench tools. The heavy scent of damp soil and ancient stone filled the barnyard as the spade cut deep into the earth, fracturing the long silence that had hung over the property since the dawn raid. The local gendarme stood near the entrance of the barn, his arms crossed over his chest, as he kept his eyes locked on the man who had ordered the destruction of his friends. No one offered a word of encouragement, and no one broke the steady rhythm of the iron cutting into the clay, establishing a public, undeniable record of accounting that the entire district would remember for generations. Pierre Fournier returned to his duties in the district of Chartres after the German retreat, continuing to wear the faded blue uniform of the local gendarmerie for another 12 years. He worked quietly to rebuild the local records, ensuring that the sacrifice of the Moreau family was permanently inscribed in the municipal registry of honors. He spent his remaining years living in a small stone cottage near the edge of the town, where he kept a handwritten copy of his original eyewitness testimony inside a wooden lockbox in his study. He passed away peacefully in the winter of 1956, remembered by the local farmers as the man who refused to let the memory of his friends fade into the dark. Stefan Lang was captured by British security forces near the northern border in May of 1945. While attempting to blend into a column of regular military refugees, he was turned over to a war crimes tribunal, where the meticulous documentation collected by the American intelligence officers was used to secure a full conviction for unlawful executions. He served 20 years in a maximum security prison before being released into the quiet anonymity of post-war West Germany, where he lived in total isolation until his death in 1972. He never expressed regret to the investigators, maintaining until his final hours that he had simply been an administrator fulfilling the explicit requirements of his station. General Patton kept a copy of the gendarme's report inside his personal field desk for the remainder of the European campaign, occasionally referencing the incident in his private correspondence as an example of absolute civilian courage. In a letter written to his family later that autumn, he noted that the true strength of an army is found in the ordinary people who refuse to bow to a tyrant when the stakes are highest. He stated that the 4 civilians buried on that French farm had demonstrated a level of devotion that standard military decorations could never fully capture. Some historians have argued that Patton exceeded his authority by granting full military honors to foreign civilians who were not members of the United States Armed Forces. They contend that such decorations should be strictly reserved for uniformed personnel to maintain the clear distinction between regular combatants and non-combatants during a major campaign. Others have argued the opposite, defending the decision as a brilliant act of psychological warfare and a profound moral statement that recognized the true reality of total resistance. They maintain that the Moreau family performed a vital military function that directly saved an American life at the cost of their own. What is certain is that the 4 graves on that farmstead remain an permanent, official record of a commander who placed absolute justice above standard bureaucratic protocol. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have ordered full military honors for these civilian heroes? Or would you have left their story to the traditional war crimes investigators? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the silence that screamed louder than any shell, make sure to subscribe.